Okay, so I think last week went very well, very well. It seems like most of you actually viewed the video. There was about 500 views. And I imagine it's mostly you guys. I don't imagine there's a lot of people on YouTube who would actually want to go and sit and listen to a lecturer speak. So it must have been you guys, the nurses. So I'm happy. Anyways, only 500 of you viewed the video, so probably you guys viewed it more than once. But some of you then didn't write the quiz. Caution, write the quiz. I'm saying this because I have 320 of you registered on a Canva and only 289 or something like that wrote the quiz. So some of you missed it. If you missed it for a valid reason, email me. If you missed it because you were too late in getting yourself added onto our Canva because you didn't message me early enough, that's your fault. But at least we'll make up for it as we go along. Last week was really more about an introduction and letting you guys understand how things are marked and done. Kind of. I hope I filled those gaps for you. If I didn't, just tell me. Email me, however. Today really is the work. The work is starting today. So I hope you guys can see this. Today we're going to be discussing pharmacokinetics. Pharmacodynamics we'll get into a bit later, but today first is pharmacokinetics. I know this word seems crazy. Well, all of these words will seem crazy to you guys at first. That's why you eat your bag of rice little by little, not much, small amounts. If you eat too much of it at once, you simply won't get all of it in. You'll leave a lot of leftovers, like work you didn't understand, and those leftover work becomes your percentages in the examination you will be missing. So once again, consistent work now really comes into play. Now we really are starting with difficult work here. Right. You know what I really like about this system is I can actually gather my thoughts before we go on. Awesome. Anyways, so let's open this up, make it big screen, and then we can get started. So, outcomes-wise, I think all of you can read, or most of those things you're reading now, those questions won't even make sense to you until you've actually discussed some of the work. So, once again, even if you do go over the outcomes now, they won't make sense without you even being prepared. It's like you want to go and do a comrades, but you didn't actually train for the comrades. There's no way you would be able. You first have to go and train, and then you can do the comrades. So this year, this is representing 90 kilometers of distance. You are not ready. You first need to eat some rice. Carbo load. Okay, so those are the outcomes we will get through. And I think all of them will become more apparent as we go along. And if I miss something, we'll go back and then we'll redo it. So first of all, before we can go into pharmacokinetics, you have to first establish what you guys know. So you guys should know already that the human body is a mix of a bunch of things, a bunch of organs working together, various tissue types that are gathered in such a way that things can happen. For example, my heart is beating right now. My heart is supplying my muscles with blood. The blood is supplying glycogen to my muscles. Glycogen is being broken down by my mitochondria into ATP, and ATP is used for muscle contractions. So those are a bunch of biological processes that we can intervene upon to create an effect. I maybe be jumping a little bit too far for you now, but we have a homeostasis going on. All of those things I explained, kind of mentioned just now, are things that are happening normally, normal processes that are maintaining homeostasis. And these normal processes, there are a bunch of enzymes, neurotransmitters, hormones, endogenous substances, meaning substances produced by our body that are interacting with one another or interacting with different tissues or organs to create certain effects. So these are the processes that we can target with drugs, small molecules, and then we can influence how these substances, hormones, enzymes, etc. would have bound to different organs or different tissues to produce effects. So this is what we're targeting. So up until this point, you should understand that we have a normal homeostasis, and this homeostasis is an array of 1,000 different things happening at once. I think you guys have done hub. I think you guys have done the electron transport chain. That's a part of the Krebs cycle. Just remember how complicated that Krebs cycle was, how many enzymes and how many neurotransmitters were involved in that cycle. I don't think neurotransmitters, let's just say enzymes, were involved in that cycle. All of those things are happening at once, and the end product of all of that, the Krebs cycle, is to create energy. So that's a part of the normal processes that we can influence. Just to give an example of how many processes there are happening at one stage in the body. Just if I'm thinking about contracting a muscle in my arm, there's a message being sent from my brain to my muscle. How is that message conveyed? So I hope you guys can remember about acetylcholine and neurotransmitters and the nicotinic receptors on the muscle. I think if you don't, we'll discuss it as we go along. And I think that sets the tone for the lecture. Now we can start with pharmacokinetics. But I also want to pause these things so I can prepare myself properly. Okay, so we haven't actually discussed much yet. We just basically said homeostasis. Your bodies have a homeostasis running at all time. And this homeostasis is kept with various endogenous substances, enzymes, neurotransmitters, hormones, etc, etc, etc. Okay, stop there. Before we go too much further, let's talk about pharmacokinetics. So keep that idea about the homeostasis just paused quickly, because it will more fit into pharmacodynamics later on. Pharmacokinetics is about what our body does to a drug. So, where does the drug go when we drink it? How does the drug actually get into our bloodstream? How does our body get rid of the drug? And how does our body make the drug less lethal, or not less lethal, less effective, or deactivate the drug, you could say? And then how does our body get rid of it? How does our body excrete it? So all of these things are termed into absorption, distribution, metabolism, which could also be elimination or biotransformation, and then excretion. So you can remember these ones with ADME. So all of these things are basically, well, let's simplify it with ADME. That's a very basic way of putting it, but all of these things have 1,000 little processes involved with how they actually work. And I think we are going to discuss some of them in detail, but not all of them. Okay, so remember that the previous slide was about homeostasis. Now we are disrupting homeostasis with a drug. Now, what will our body do to that drug? And then what will the drug do to the body comes next in pharmacodynamics. So first, pharmacokinetics. What does our body do to the drug? Because our body wants to preserve homeostasis. Remember that. I'm not moving forward. Move forward. Okay. So let's start with absorption. How does absorption actually happen? So this is a nice concentration time curve here. And these curves really is an oversimplification of everything that's happening in the body all at once. Or everything that's happening in the body when you take a drug. All the pharmacokinetic things. So let's say, for example, you have a headache. How does it happen that when you have a headache, you take a paracetamol, the paracetamol cures your headache? Does it mean that the drug only goes to your head? Must I give a few seconds pause here so you guys can think about it? Then does the drug only go to your head? Where does the drug go? How does it know where the pain is? How does it know where to go and fix the pain? Does it have some kind of mind to it? Can it go there and fix the problem? And just simply put, no. All drugs are, let's say, all drugs get distributed throughout your body according to a bunch of chemical laws, or chemical laws sounds so terrible, physiological laws. I can rather say physiological laws. And the physiological laws also speak to the chemical laws or the chemistry of a drug. So let's take the example of paracetamol just here quickly. You have a massive headache because you guys are students and you probably went to, I don't know where students go these days anymore. I'm getting so old. Anyways, you guys went to a party, you have a hangover the next day, you take a paracetamol, and the paracetamol cures your headache. Wow, how did it do that? So you took the drug. We start with ADME. What did your body do to the drug? I will get to what the drug does to your body later on. So first you took the drug, and my mouse has just disappeared. There's my mouse. You took the drug. So you swallowed it in, and then it got digested, it got dissolved, it got disintegrated into tiny, tiny little particles, and the particles then got suspended or dissolved in water inside of your stomach, or the stomach fluid, or the gastric contents. And then those contents were absorbed most likely through your ileum or jejunum over there out. And then the drug gets distributed via your bloodstream, this is your bloodstream, but basically everywhere. So the drug doesn't discriminate, it goes wherever it can go. So where it can go is depending on what the molecule looks like and what physical characteristics it has, lipophilicity or hydrophilicity. But we'll discuss those a little bit in more detail just now, but not too much. It's not really something you guys will be working with the rest of your lives. So the drug will then be distributed everywhere it can go, and that's basically this phase. So we've got absorption here. The drug is being disintegrated and dissolved in the stomach fluid. The stomach fluid is then moved to the ileum, jejunum, the duodenum, ileum, jejunum, the small intestine where absorption mostly happens, and then it gets absorbed. Well, basically this entire process has been absorption the whole time. But then we reach a plateau here. Remember, this is a concentration, and this concentration refers to the blood plasma concentration, and this refers to time down here. So your blood plasma is increasing in concentration as absorption is happening. And then all of a sudden, when the drug is completely dissolved and not in the stomach anymore, completely been absorbed, then we get this little... Why is my mouse just spinning the whole time? It's so frustrating. Then we get this peak here. And at this peak, so all of the drug that could be absorbed is now absorbed, and now the drug is being metabolized. So at this peak here, metabolism is going to start happening. And metabolism is this phase here, where drug is being metabolized, actively metabolized. So as soon as the drug is distributed throughout your body, through your bloodstream to various tissues, there is various pathways with which metabolism happens. But let's, for sake of simplicity, say metabolism mostly happens in the liver and in the kidneys. So as the drug is within the bloodstream and the tissues, it's now being metabolized. So being transformed into a different compound or being excreted, etc. And our blood concentration starts dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. So metabolism is usually where a drug is transformed into something that's not active. And then excretion happens afterwards. There's a lot of drugs that also become excreted without being metabolized, like very hydrophilic drugs, vancomycin, amikacin, gentamicin. Don't remember those examples. I won't ask you questions like that yet, later on, but not yet. But for simplicity's sake, metabolism itself is changing a drug to a less active form that doesn't actually have a pharmacological effect, and then excretion is getting rid of the drug, getting the drug out of the body. Let's take alcohol as an example quickly and just run with alcohol here. So if you drink alcohol gets absorbed. And there's a bunch of things that also influence how fast it gets absorbed. So if you drink a beer, you'll drink it over an hour, so your absorption will be much slower. If you drink a shot of tequila, you drink a shot of tequila, this concentration curve will spike here, because a high concentration will lead to faster passive diffusion. High concentration, remember the diffusion's law? The diffusion's law is from going from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if the concentration of the alcohol in the ileum or duodenum in the small intestine is big, and the concentration of alcohol in your bloodstream itself is low, alcohol will move from the high concentration to the low concentration faster, because the concentration gradient is larger. Whereas if you take something like beer, the concentration of alcohol inside the beer is much, much less. So the concentration gradient isn't as large, so it won't happen as fast. Okay, anyways, it gets absorbed. Then our body has something called alcohol dehydrogenase. So that's the enzyme that's responsible for breaking down the alcohol. And it breaks it down from alcohol into aldehydes. I won't ask you something like that in an exam yet. Anyways, so our liver is responsible for metabolizing alcohol, and our liver can metabolize something like 7.5 grams of alcohol per hour. There's also some variability in here. Of course, if you're alcoholic, your liver starts making more and more of this enzyme, so you metabolize faster and faster and faster. And of course, if you're a lady, you tend to make less. So ladies tend to make between 5 and 7.5 grams, or they can metabolize between 5 and 7.5 grams of alcohol per hour. So in other words, if you drink, I'll do that calculation in class. I don't want to confuse you guys too much now. Anyways, you metabolize that amount of alcohol. Alcohol has become metabolized. So we are basically here on this curve now. It's happening the whole time. And then the alcohol is changing to aldehydes. That's the first metabolism part. And then we have aldehydes changing into something else. I can't remember. And then we have excretion happening. So alcohol is a nice example, and I think we'll use alcohol to explain a lot of the pharmacokinetics as we go along. Also, since I think everyone knows alcohol, where not as many of you know warfarin yet. You will know warfarin eventually, trust me. And I think let's pause quickly again. Okay, so I think I've mentioned enough things about this curve now, but the curve really is an oversimplification of everything that goes into pharmacokinetics. So ADME, remember that. So absorption, my mouse is gone again, absorption, distribution is happening at the same time as well, but don't get too technical. Metabolism and excretion is happening at the same time, yeah. And then eventually you have a very low concentration of the drug left in the body. Anyways, this curve is important, but now let's break down what goes into ADME, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. Okay, so first things you have to understand is absorption, and I think I've basically explained what I said here just now, so let's go to the next one. So to understand absorption, you have to understand that not all cells are the same, and all cells have a phospholipid bilayer around them. can I just put this into perspective? When you drink alcohol, for example, if you drink alcohol and it ends up in your duodenum, ileum, and ileum, it can be absorbed from there. But you can't just throw alcohol out onto your skin and get it absorbed. So our skin doesn't allow alcohol to be passed through it, but the cells within our lumen of our cells within our gastrointestinal tract can allow alcohol to pass through it to be absorbed. So you have to understand that not all cells are the same, and there are a bunch of different things that influence how we can actually absorb alcohol. If your skin, for example, let alcohol through, you can get drunk by just touching alcohol, but you can't. So let's go into a little bit more detail about that. First thing you have to understand, next page. First thing you have to understand is that we are basically sacks of fluid, or in pharmacokinetic terms, we use the liters or the amount of volume of fluid in the bodies to explain where a drug goes. So if you look at this page here, let's say this is an average 70 kilogram person. A 70 kilogram person has about 5 liters of blood. 3 liters of that is plasma, and 2 liters of that is actually the cells itself, the red blood cells, the leukocytes, lymphocytes, whatever you want to call it. And then we have about 27 liters of intracellular water. So this intracellular water refers to all of our cells, our cardiac cells, our skeletal muscle cells, all of the cells in the body contains an amount of water, the cytosol, if you can remember it correctly. So that's where the most water is in most cases. So, but once, like I just told you, not all drugs or not all compounds can be absorbed by all cells. For example, alcohol can't be absorbed by your corneocytes on your skin, but they can be absorbed. I can't remember the cells on the inside of the stomach's name, but they can be absorbed through the cells in the gastrointestinal tract, if that makes sense. Let's break down the water further. So we basically have 5 liters of blood. We have 12 liters of interstitial water and 15 liters of extracellular water. So the extracellular water refers to, I think the image might explain this better than I can. If you just look at this page here quickly, that's the bloodstream there. See it? And then we have the interstitial space. The interstitial space, or the extravascular space, is around all of these different cells. So let's say, for example, that this is an artery or a capillary running through a liver, and these are all of the hepatocytes. Yes, hepatocytes are the right name for liver cells. And then this will be the extravascular space and the interstitial water. So interstitial water or interstitial volume refers to the actual water surrounding the different cells. So the water between the capillaries running through the liver and the hepatocyte itself. And then we have, I think I've explained all of it just now. So that's the cell itself, so that's intracellular. That's extravascular. Extravascular can actually refer to the cells itself and also the interstitial spaces, because that's everything outside of the vascular system. And then we have, we said intracellular, extravascular, but extravascular also refers to intracellular and interstitial. And we have interstitial. So interstitial is the spaces between all of these cells you can see there. Okay, so the reason why this slide is important is because when drugs are distributed, they tend to go where the chemical properties dictate them to go. So a drug, for example, like alcohol, is very, very, very hydrophilic, very water-ish or polar. So a drug like alcohol tends to stay within the intravascular space and tends not to actually be distributed outwards, because it doesn't have that lipophilicity or that fattiness it needs to actually cross a phospholipid bilayer, if that makes sense. But if we take a drug like corticosteroids are extremely they're based off cortisone, or based off cortisone. What's the right word for it now? Cholesterol, yes. So corticosteroids are based on that molecule, the cholesterol molecule. The cholesterol molecule itself is very neutral, and it's also very lipophilic. So that means it can easily be distributed over cell membranes. So if you take a drug like hydrocortisone or methylprednisone, the corticosteroids, it might end up actually being distributed into cells more actively, if that makes sense to you guys. So a drug that's very hydrophilic tends to stay intravascularly. A drug that's very lipophilic tends to actually concentrate into certain tissues. I hope I'm making sense here. What do I want to discuss here? Maybe give me 2 seconds of pause so we can just think. But just quickly to review, we have all of these different compartments that contain a certain amount of water. When we measure a drug's concentration, we tend to measure the bloodstream itself. So we can't actually measure the intracellular water, but we're measuring the bloodstream itself. That's maybe one thing I also want to mention. And if you look at this curve here, this curve itself is measuring the blood concentration of a drug per time. So there's a few dilemmas around this, and I will get to that. I just want your thoughts to kind of just prickle around it for the meantime. And small break. Okay, so I've just reorganized my slides a little bit for you guys, I think for simplicity's sake. So I spoke about all of these different fluid spaces, all of these different compartments, and how drugs distribute through these compartments, how one would be more intravascular, one would be more intracellular. But before we get there, we have to get the drug into the body first. And I think let's combine two things quickly here. I have discussed a little bit now about how drugs distribute. But before that, how do we actually get the drug into the body? Let's concentrate on the absorption first. I think my slides were a bit misleading, but I think the book itself is also misleading a little bit here. And I use the book's format to make your slides. And I think let's focus on absorption first before we go on with the rest of distribution, because the compartments really have more to do with distribution than absorption itself. Okay, so in a certain sense, put everything I said on the previous slide back in your mind once again, and let's concentrate on absorption itself. So first thing you need to understand is we have absorption from a bunch of various sites, a bunch of different sites. So you get absorption from intramuscular, subcutaneous, or oral, or you can even get absorption from suppositories. You get absorption from a bunch of different phases, but you do not get absorption from intravenous routes. Can you think why? So there's your intravenous route. Why would you not get absorption from your intravenous group? And why are my slides looking so weird now? Cancel, do not exit. Any ideas? No, that's the one. Why would you not get absorption from your intravenous route? Remember, absorption is the process where the body takes a molecule and puts it into the bloodstream. So if I bypass all of the membranes and everything that separates your bloodstream from the rest of your body, and I just inject something directly into your bloodstream, how can it be absorbed? It's already in there. So if you inject something directly into the bloodstream, you get basically 100% bioavailability. A drug is 100% absorbed. I hope it makes sense. Then if you take something by oral, it might take much longer for it to be absorbed. So just look at this over here, for example. This is an oral route, the purple one. Absorbs much slower, and then eliminates slower as well. Whereas you put something in IV, there's no absorption phase, so it just gets metabolized from the moment it gets. No, it doesn't get metabolized immediately. It first gets distributed, so you're skipping absorption. You're doing distribution, metabolism, and excretion. Intramuscular absorption is much faster intramuscularly than it is via the oral route. But there are a few things to take into consideration with the intramuscular route, and I will get to that in a little bit. Subcutaneous absorption is much slower than the absorption from intramuscular, and this should make sense because your blood supply to your muscles is obviously large. Your blood supply to your subcutaneous fat is obviously low, because your fat doesn't actually do anything, it just sits there, but your muscles need to exercise and store glycogen and glucose to actually do things. So, of course, you have more blood supply to your muscles, so blood will take away the drug from that area much faster than it would from the subcutaneous area. Okay, there's a few things I wanted to mention there. Now I want to quickly go over here to this picture. I'm going to discuss a few things, and they might come into the slides again a bit later, so just bear with me here. Can you see there's a bunch of percentages here? You see there's a bunch of percentages on top here. Estradiol, testosterone, sumatriptan, etc. So these are all examples of drugs that become metabolized before they enter the bloodstream. So as soon as you take a drug and it enters into your small intestine over there, the bloodstream from your small intestine first distributes blood into your liver via the portal vein, and then the liver does something to the drug called the first pass effect. So during the first pass effect, a lot of the drug will actually be metabolized into an active form or simply lost. So these percentages you're seeing on top here are actually, and my mouse has disappeared again, it's back. These percentages you're seeing on top here are actually examples of drugs being metabolized beforehand. So drugs being metabolized directly after they've been ingested. So a lot of drugs are extensively metabolized via the first pass effect. So propranolol here, for example, I think it's about 23% as far as I have it, but I hear the 20 to 50% in this example here. So you've got about 23% left of the drug that goes into your bloodstream after you ingest it. What that means is, if I gave you 100 milligrams of propranolol and you drank it, only 23% of the propranolol would actively be distributed within your bloodstream after the absorption phase. Because during the absorption phase, you get so much elimination via the first pass effect that you actually lose 77. You lose 77 milligrams, 77% of the drug due to the first pass effect. Kind of insane if you think about it. So what can you do? You can simply avoid the first pass effect and go intramuscularly, because from your muscles itself, it doesn't immediately go to the liver, the bloodstream. It doesn't immediately go to the liver, it goes to various other areas. But from your gastrointestinal tract itself, your bloodstream from there goes into your liver first. That's also a natural defense mechanism, I'm guessing, what we had over many years, and it's your body's way of detoxifying or metabolizing something that might be toxic to your body before it even goes to anywhere else. Okay, I wanted to mention all of that. Oh, there is the first pass effect. I put it in there anyways. There's a question there. Do all drugs undergo the first pass effect? Yes and no. So any drug you take orally will go through the liver. Will the liver deactivate it? Not necessarily. So some drugs will be deactivated extensively or even activated. So some drugs we call prodrugs are not even activated when you take them. They only become activated after they were metabolized by the liver via the first pass effect. So not all drugs will undergo first pass, but all drugs will be distributed to the liver when they are taken orally. Okay, let's go into these things here quickly. So this slide really refers to things that influences the oral bioavailability or the oral absorption, so meaning the absorption of a drug that's taken orally. So when you take a drug orally, the solubility of a drug plays a role. So when I give you, the coin is back, when I give you this paracetamol to swallow, it's in this tablet form. Your body or your stomach contents first has to disintegrate it into smaller pieces and then dissolve it into a solution, or a solution into a dissolution. Dissolve it into a solution. Okay. As soon as it's in a solution, then your body can actually start absorbing it. So the solubility of a drug plays a big role. If a drug is not very soluble, the absorption of it will be much slower. We also use this to our own advantage. So a lot of you'll see in the pharmacy, you get a lot of slow releases, or you get a lot of XR drugs, extended release drugs. So in those cases, we've taken various other compounds, we've combined them into the tablet to make the tablet less soluble, and if the tablet is less soluble, it takes much longer to be absorbed. Okay, then the concentration of the drug. So use the alcohol example. The alcohol example is the easiest. You will get a higher concentration of alcohol into your bloodstream when you take a shot versus taking a drink that has a smaller alcohol concentration. So the concentration itself, if you have a very high concentration in the stomach, you'll have a much bigger concentration gradient, and that concentration gradient forces the drug from a high concentration to a low concentration. So in your case, if you're drinking a lot because you're partying, you've got a very big concentration of alcohol in the stomach because you just drank 5 shots because you're crazy. And from there, the concentration gradient will be massive to the bloodstream, because the bloodstream, you didn't drink any shots before this. Even if you did, it gets dissolved into so much blood, the concentration in your bloodstream won't be high. So a shot will force the concentration gradient to be high, and the absorption will be much faster. Okay, so the concentration of a drug plays a role into the absorption of a drug. The size of the absorbing surface. So, of course, do you guys remember how big your surface area of your small intestine is? I think it was something of like a football field. I can't remember those facts anymore, but the bigger the size of the absorbing surfaces, the more contact there is between the drug itself, the solution with the drug inside, and the body itself from the absorption site. So the more absorption site is exposed, the more absorption can happen. This is only important if you have a drug that doesn't get absorbed in the duodenum, for example. Maybe only gets absorbed in the stomach. The absorption will be much, much slower in the stomach because the surface area within the stomach is much smaller than the surface area within the small intestine. This can also play a role if you think about something like something that you take subbuccally. So subbuccally is the root that goes under your tongue. So under your tongue, you don't have a very big surface area under your tongue. The surface area is kind of small. So the absorption rate will be very slow for a lot of drugs. But there's also a way around that. And we'll kind of discuss it a bit later on, but I'm not sure how much to what depth. And then we have another factor there, the blood supply to the site of administration. So like I just told you guys, the subcutaneous area, or the subcutaneous fat, is just fat. So the blood supply to the subcutaneous area is very, very small. So the bloodstream supply to muscle is much, much higher. So the more bloodstream, the more blood is actually circulated through the muscle, the faster something will be absorbed from the muscle. So if you inject a very aqueous drug, so a drug it's a solution of, for example, diclofenac, which is Voltaren, inside of a water base. That will distribute from a high concentration to a low concentration rapidly within the muscle. And because the bloodstream is very high, the concentration will be carried away the whole time. So the small concentration will remain in the area the whole time until the high concentration, which is the administration site itself, has been completely absorbed. But if you do this in fat, the blood supply is not very fast in the area, so the concentration gradient will not be as high. So it will be much, much slower. Okay. I don't think I've got anything else I wanted to mention in this slide here. I think I've mentioned a lot there. I think I've mentioned first pass. I think you should understand first pass now. Oral route is the safest route because it's much, much slower. Think about this. If you are at some kind of American frat party at Kappa Beta Theta, I don't know what they call themselves anymore, and some misguided medical student has the idea to administer alcohol intravenously. Okay, it's not really possible. Well, it kind of is possible, but it's very deadly or very crazy. But let's just live in an imaginary world like the movies. If you give someone 20 shots of tequila via the intravenous system, it'll be absorbed into the bloodstream immediately, and all of that alcohol will probably cause some central nervous system depression, so the person will most likely die, and you won't be able to get the drug out of the body fast enough. Whereas if the person was stupid enough to take the 20 shots, you can still go vomit it out because it doesn't get absorbed immediately. Whereas if you do it intravenously, it's absorbed immediately. So hence the slower and less reliable. So oral route is much slower and less reliable, but it's much, much safer for that reason as well. We still have we can still get a person to vomit, or we can give them activated charcoal because it's not absorbed into the body yet. Remember, the gastrointestinal tract is not it's part of the body, but whatever is inside of the gastrointestinal tract is basically just within a big tube that connects one hole to the other hole. It's not actually inside of the body yet via the bloodstream. Subcutaneous routes. Something I wanted to mention about subcutaneous routes. But I'm thinking too much about too many other things. Okay, but I can remember most of what I want to mention here. Let me just get a pen. So, in the subcutaneous route, I've got an example here of, let me just quickly find it. No, that's not what I want to mention. Let me just quickly take a break. I think I'm going to confuse you. Okay, so typical of me, I do get sidetracked a little bit. Let's go back to these four factors and let's go into solubility again. So a drug cannot be absorbed unless it's in a solution or it's completely dissolved. So this only refers to the oral route of administration. So if I take this tablet, it must be dissolved completely. Once it's dissolved completely, it can be absorbed. But a drug can also be too hydrophilic or too lipophilic, then it can also not be absorbed. Remember what I told you guys about the gastrointestinal tracts, those cells itself? So some drugs can pass through it, which are lipophilic enough, and some drugs are not lipophilic enough, and they can't pass through it. They have to be absorbed via different means, like active transport or those little pores, but we'll get there. So if a drug is too lipophilic, for example, depotestosterone. So testosterone itself cannot be absorbed when you take it orally. You have to change something about the structure before it can actually be absorbed orally. Then we won't actually get enough absorption from the oral route. Then you have to make it into a different route, and that's why it's made into a injection. Think about Depo-Provera as well. You guys have probably seen it in practice. Depo-Provera is progesterone. Progesterone is, well, not all progesterones, but that specific progesterone in Depo-Provera is too lipophilic and cannot be absorbed because it cannot go into a dissolution or into a solution to be absorbed. So a drug has to always be in a solution before it can actually be absorbed. And that's one of the problems with many drugs. So some drugs can go into a solution and are very soluble, so they can easily go into a solution, but they are not lipophilic enough to be absorbed across the membrane. Some drugs, on the other hand again, are too lipophilic and they can't go into a solution. So there's a balance that we have to get between lipid solubility and water solubility. Okay. I think I've mentioned a lot of this again. So for example, there are some drugs that can only be administered with IV because they can't be absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract. So think of a few antibiotics. They've got aminoglycosides, amikacin, gentamicin, vancomycin. So a lot of those drugs are so hydrophilic that they can't actually so hydrophilic and so big they can't actually pass through the gastrointestinal tract cells to into the systemic circulation. So we have to inject them directly into the systemic circulation or intramuscularly or subcutaneously to get some absorption to actually happen. Okay. I've mentioned all of that I want to mention there. Another example is, for example, liquid paraffin or medicinal paraffin. Medicinal paraffin is a lipid soluble drug, but it's so lipid soluble it can't be absorbed because it can't actually go into a dissolution or it can't be dissolved in the gastrointestinal content, so it can't actually be absorbed at all, so it just stays in the gastrointestinal tract. That's why we use it for constipation so much. Another thing I can also mention is something like tablets. Why would you take grandpa powder above grandpa tablets? Because when it's grinded, when it's broken down into a powder, it goes into a solution much faster. If it's in a solution, it gets absorbed faster. If it gets absorbed, it can actually start working faster. So that's why many drugs, we actually break them down into powders first, so they can be absorbed faster. Tablets have to be disintegrated in the gastrointestinal tract and then have to go into the solution first before they can be absorbed. So we can make it a tablet. We can grind it down to a powder. Areas of absorption, I think I've mentioned this a little bit now, but generally speaking, no, I have mentioned a lot of this already. Generally speaking, most of the absorption of most drugs happen in the small intestine. That's what you have to remember. If you remember that, you'll fine. Another thing I wanted to mention here is about food. Do you always have to take tablets with food? Do you? Well, not necessarily. So some tablets and some capsules actually are better to take without food, so like flucloxacillin for example. But there are many, well, generally speaking, it's a safe rule to say that you should take a tablet with food. In most cases, it's, well, I'm saying very general here, but not always. But in most cases, it's better to take a tablet with food because you're preventing a lot of gastric irritation. And another thing is, if you take it with food, you'll actually delay gastric emptying, so the absorption itself will be slower. If you take a tablet on an empty stomach, the concentration will be much higher in the stomach, and then absorption will most likely be faster. What can influence this? Well, things like diarrhea. If you have diarrhea, the drug doesn't actually stay in the small intestine long enough because it's passing through so fast, you don't actually get absorption. Kind of obvious if you think about it there. Okay, this is the one I was stuck on with the blood supply. Blood supply in the area will dictate also how fast something is absorbed, how slow it's absorbed. And I want to combine this also with the formulation of a drug. So let's take something like Depo-Provera. Is it Depo-Provera? Am I using the right one? I think Depo-Provera is an example. But let's use another one. Let's use Nebido. Nebido is a combination of testosterone that's mixed in an oily base, an oily solution. So, when it's mixed in this oily solution and you inject it into the muscle, your body has to break down that oily solution to free the testosterone first. So, this process of breaking down the oil in the muscle takes a long time. So, the testosterone, the active ingredient in this injection, is released slowly from that oily solution. So, it takes a long time before it's completely dissolved and absorbed into the bloodstream. Whereas, if you take something, if you take a testosterone, or like a testosterone inside of a liquid aqueous base, the absorption will be much faster because the water itself in that area will be absorbed into the surrounding muscle much faster. So the formulation itself plays a role in how fast something is absorbed, and also we can manipulate it with other drugs. So if you have something like, have you gone to the dentist? Let's ask that first. If you've gone to the dentist before, you've gotten this injection and you've gotten a tooth pulled, for example, they inject you with something into your gums. And that something contains bupivacaine or novocaine or one of the caines meaning local anesthetic agents, mixed with adrenaline. Because adrenaline causes all of those capillaries, all of those little arteries in the gums to contract powerfully. And then when they're contracted, the drug itself can't be distributed out of those capillaries anymore, and then it stays behind. And because it stays behind, you don't get the drug going elsewhere in the body after the injection and causing some side effects. It's only staying local. Interesting if you think about it that way. And now we get to distribution of drugs. And distribution of drugs, we have discussed a little bit, but there's a lot more to discuss. And I think my time for preparation for class is running out. So we'll just have class in a few minutes, and then I'll make these videos complete anyways. And then you guys can, at the end of the term, tell me which ones you like more, videos or class. Bye-bye. Okay, I've got some more time, so let's quickly finish what we can finish. So we've gotten up till this point here. So we've discussed basically now a bunch of different things that influence absorptions. I hope you guys realize one of the things I'm doing is I'm trying to explain concepts instead of just reading you the definitions. So you guys, of course, use the slides to understand, use my videos to understand, but read whatever you have to read. So book, slides, read through everything, and then try and make sense of it with the explanations I give you as well. Okay, so the next step we have to go into is distribution. So distribution, where do I want to start? Distribution is basically from the absorption point. Where does the drug go? What's next? So it has like this little journey it goes on. Where will it go? Where will it end up? So we have a bunch of very different tissues. I've already mentioned part of this a little bit, but so think of, for example, about your central nervous system, so your spine and your brain. Will a drug always reach that area? Maybe, maybe not. And how will the drug actually get distributed to that area? Will it be dissolved within the bloodstream? Or is there maybe something like a few proteins in the bloodstream that can help us distribute drugs? So, yes and no. Over here, if you think about distribution, think about everything after the absorption phase. So think of the absorption phase as getting a drug into your bloodstream, and then after something is in your bloodstream, it gets distributed to where, and that'll depend on the drug, the physiochemical properties of a drug. So it'll be distributed maybe to the brain a little bit, maybe to the lungs, maybe to the kidney, maybe everywhere, and then etc. So, I think I've mentioned the spaces in the body. So, remember I spoke about the interstitial spaces, the extravascular spaces, the vascular space. We've mentioned a bunch of those a little bit now. And different drugs will go into different areas depending on the physiochemical properties. Let's just quickly go to alcohol again. If you take a lot of alcohol, your blood concentration will be very high. But because alcohol is so hydrophilic, it won't necessarily be distributed within all cellular spaces, so within all cells. Cardiac cells, for example, might not get as much. Liver cells, I think liver cells do get a lot, but skeletal muscle cells, for example, alcohol doesn't distribute into all those cells. It really tends to stay in the intravascular space because it is so hydrophilic. And something like prednisone or cortisone will be distributed into all cells everywhere because it's so, what's the right word? Polar. Lipophilic. I think we've discussed this already. We've discussed that the cell has an oil phase and a water phase. It's a phospholipid bilayer, so it's got cholesterol inside there. And it's got proteins, so the proteins are polar and the cholesterol is non-polar. So a drug molecule needs both to actually get in and out of cells. So what I wanted to mention here is this slide. No, this slide. Okay, it really falls into what I meant to mention here. So think of drug molecules as big and large, just as simple as that. So small molecules can easily just via passive diffusion end up in the body. So that really goes like alcohol, for example. Alcohol is just everywhere today. Alcohol is a very small molecule, so it can easily be absorbed via passive diffusion. But most molecules in our body, or most drugs that we want to take, are really large molecules. So how do we actually get them absorbed? And most of them will undergo passive diffusion the same way, but they will have to go through the cell membranes itself, and that really limits a lot of them being absorbed systemically. So a lot of them can't be, a lot of them can be. And once again, I'm talking about the oral route here. Let me just quickly remember what I mentioned. It was about how big and how small a drug is. Okay, so simply put, a bunch of them are just too big. So they have to go through the drug, through the lipid layers of the gastrointestinal tracts, cells. Okay, so they have to go through the cells to be absorbed. While small molecules can just go via filtration be absorbed. And that's what I want to mention. And there's also another way. A lot of drugs we can absorb. A lot of drugs are absorbed via active transport. So these are normally drugs that are similar to endogenous substances our body actually has transport proteins for, and they would simply be picked up and carried over. Filtration are for the very small drugs, passive diffusion is for the very big drugs, so most of them, and carrier-mediated transport is this active transport I'm talking about. So endogenous proteins, or drugs that we make that are similar to endogenous proteins, can just be absorbed via this carrier-mediated transport. And that's what I want to mention about that. The reason why I'm skipping that is because there's an extremely important part of this distribution which I want you guys to stay with here. There's also a lot of kind of information overload in your books about distribution. I don't want you guys to go into too much detail about that because it really isn't as important for understanding the basics, and there's nothing we can really tell you about active carrier mediated transport. We won't really mention so much about that in all the basic pharmacology, so not really something I want to go into a lot, but there is something I want to go into a lot. So drug is absorbed, it's crossed a cell membrane, it's a large molecule, it's maybe very lipophilic, so it's maybe too lipophilic to go into the solution within the bloodstream. So what will happen to the drug? Any takers, any questions? Anyways, so we've got these things in our body called plasma proteins. Plasma proteins, albumin is the one, the other one is alpha glycoprotein. So most bases bind to alpha glycoprotein, I think, and most acids bind to albumin, but that doesn't matter. What you have to know is that drugs bind to proteins in the bloodstream to get distributed, and it depends on drug to drug. So some drugs are very protein bound, like warfarin, and some drugs are not protein bound at all, like vancomycin. So it really depends from drug to drug how they are carried in the bloodstream. When a drug is bound to a protein, it can't be eliminated, so it can't be metabolized, and it also can't actually do its mechanism. It can't do its work. It can only do its work after it's left that carrier protein on that plasma protein. So I'm mentioning this because if you have a drug that's 99% protein bound in the bloodstream, like warfarin is, and you take another drug that's also very protein bound, and it displaces warfarin from its site of action, or from the protein, the plasma protein, you can actually increase the effect of warfarin accidentally and get a toxic effect all of a sudden, because the one drug displaced the other one from the protein, and while it was on the protein it wasn't active, but now that it's off of the protein it becomes active. So it's important for a lot of interactions we have with different drugs. So if you take warfarin and you take aspirin, you can potentially cause an interaction that might lead to warfarin toxicity, if that makes a lot of sense. I think, oh, of course, if a drug is protein bound, what will happen to the duration of action? Do you think it will be longer or shorter? It will be longer, because as long as it's bound to the protein, it can't go do its work. It can't actually have a pharmacological effect, and it also can't be metabolized. As long as a drug is bound to a protein, it won't be metabolized. It's only when it's left that protein it becomes metabolized. And these proteins are distributing drugs throughout our entire body. And I think I've mentioned what I want to mention about that. That really is the most important part about distribution. It's about the plasma proteins and how drugs are bound to those plasma proteins. There's a bit of there's a little bit importance about the active carrier mediated transport, but it's not something I really would ask you guys. I would really only ask you things that are clinically significant rather. So active carrier mediated transport, not so clinically significant for nurses as the plasma protein binding. The plasma protein binding is far more significant. Another example for you guys would be something like valproic acid used in not valproic acid, phenytoin. Phenytoin used in a epileptic patient. It's also like 98% protein bound. But what if your body doesn't make those proteins anymore? So one of the main proteins our body makes to distribute drugs is albumin. Do you know what albumin is? If you don't know, maybe look it up. I think it must most likely in hub somewhere. But what if your body doesn't make a lot of albumin, or what if you're malnourished? What will happen to the half-life of a drug, the effect of a drug? Will it be increased? Will it be decreased? Food for thought. Actually, not food for thought. Please figure it out. Not figure it out. I'll tell you. So, if you have an albumin level of 40 grams per liter under normal circumstances, and now you're malnourished, now you have a level of 19 grams per liter, there's so much less proteins for the drug to bind to. So, a lot of the drug will now be free in the bloodstream. The more drug is free in the bloodstream, the more drug will have an effect. So you could actually have a toxic effect because the proteins are so low now. And the drug's half-life or the drug's metabolism will also be increased drastically. Okay, so something to keep in mind if you have a person or a patient with a very low albumin, and actually something to keep in mind within our population, because if people are malnourished, their albumin levels will be very low, so they might have interactions with various drugs just for that reason. I think this is basically what I was speaking about with the protein binding. So I spoke about warfarin in the same guy, it was 97%. So only the 3.6% of warfarin is actually active. So if you take something and can actually interfere with the free fraction or make the free fraction higher, you will get a increased effect or a toxic effect potentially. And of course, drugs that aren't very can't dissolve in the bloodstream actually have to bind to alpha glycoprotein and albumin to be distributed within the body. So of course that's that reason. And the blood supply to different areas of the body would also dictate how a drug is distributed. So fat, for example, once again, fat has a very low distribution or very low blood supply, or small blood supply compared to muscles. So muscles will get more of the drug. Think about the liver itself. The liver gets so much blood. The liver is like one of the main areas of what I'm talking about. The liver gets a lot of blood. So the liver would automatically be exposed to more drug than most parts of the body. Kind of explains a lot of hepatotoxicity about drugs as well. And then we have something called the blood-brain barrier. So what drugs actually reach the blood-brain barrier? Well, all drugs will reach the barrier. What drugs will be able to cross the barrier? Not much. So this really is due to these glial connective tissues there. So they're so densely packed that we have this thing called the blood-brain barrier. And this blood-brain barrier keeps a lot of drugs and a lot of substances from actually reaching the brain. So this is important because this is a very difficult thing to overcome for many of the drugs that we use. But we can overcome it with lipophilicity, making a drug more lipophilic. And we can also overcome it with making a drug more structurally related to various amino acids that our bodies would actively transport into the brain. So like levodopa and Parkinson's, for example. But how much would I ask you about that? Not much. Would I ask you about the blood-brain barrier? Yes. Would I ask you what drugs actually cross it? Not now. It will come later as you apply the principle of the blood-brain barrier. So what you have to understand about the blood-brain barrier is that it's not always crossed. Will it be more crossed in certain disease conditions? Yes. Would you know that now? No. You only learn it later. So for now, know about the blood-brain barrier and know that it makes distribution of many drugs much more complicated. And then of course, just like we have the blood-brain barrier, we also have the placenta, and we have various other barriers in the body. The placenta is basically the barrier between the mother and the baby. What can cross the placenta? Well, a lot of things. Is there general rules about it? Not really. So we know certain drugs are safe in trimester 1, trimester 2, trimester 3, but we don't have a rule to say that drugs, all this type of drugs, are safe in trimester A, B, and C. So it really is difficult to know which ones to use in what circumstances. And I think you will, as you go into each specific section of the work and specific drugs, you can discuss which ones are safe in which trimester, etc. And distribution-wise, I don't know if there's anything else I want to mention distribution-wise. The most important thing, once again, for me are the barriers and the proteins in the bloodstream that dictate distribution. And I can't really think of anything else that I want to mention now. Now we can move to metabolism. And yeah, in metabolism, there is a lot to actually go through. And now my time really is up. Now I actually have to go to that meeting. And then I'll see you guys in class just now. Thanks and bye-bye.